Welcome to Managing Wetland Vegetation of Utah Lake, the Jordan River, and the Great Salt Lake. With us today we have Keith Hambrecht. He is the Invasive Species Coordinator of the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And we have Ray Robinson. Ray is our Jordan River Vegetation Project Coordinator with the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, State Lands, and the Jordan River Commission. So with that, we'll give it to you guys. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Ray Robinson. I work on the Jordan River. I'm the Jordan River Vegetation Project Coordinator, working with Jordan River Commission and also the division.
My name is Keith Hambrecht. I'm the Invasive Species Coordinator for Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, specifically on state lands. And so today we hope to talk to you guys first about some background context for our talk, Defining Sovereign Lands and the Public Trust Doctrine. And then we'll move into the work that Ray and I do, managing vegetation, doing weed control, and plant restoration. And we hope to highlight some of the progress that we've made, talk about the challenges we face, and some future directions for our work. And we're hoping that with this presentation today, we might also promote some future collaboration.
So our division, the Division of Forestry, Fire, State Lands, is one of 8 divisions housed within the Department of Natural Resources. And we are the state lands aspect of that forestry, fire, and state lands. And one type of state lands that we manage are sovereign lands. So sovereign lands are the lands that lie below the ordinary high water mark of navigable bodies of water at the date of Utah statehood. So this includes the beds of Great Salt Lake, Utah Lake, Bear River, Jordan River, and portions of the Green and Colorado rivers. So all sovereign lands are state lands, but not all state lands are sovereign lands. Some information for everyone. Our division manages about 1.5 million acres of lake and riverbed. That includes 2,200 miles of shoreline. And these lands generate an annual revenue of about $5 to $11 million. Most of that is coming from royalties of Great Salt Lake mineral extraction. And other lands that we manage that are not sovereign lands include the Moab Exchange lands, Fremont Island of Great Salt Lake, and the Galena-Soon County Preserve on the Jordan River in Draper.
And so how do we manage these sovereign lands? We are dictated in state code to manage sovereign land for public health, public interest, public safety, and public welfare. And any proposed use on sovereign lands must be balanced against the public trust values of navigation, fish and wildlife habitat, aquatic beauty, public recreation, and water quality. As our Deputy Director of Lands likes to say, this is as public land gets. And these are very broad goals, but some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, our daily tasks, would be permitting and leasing, as well as enforcement of those. We do support recreation, sometimes funding for specific recreation enhancement. And today we're going to talk to you about our work managing vegetation in different aspects on these lands. For all of this work, because it is so much land and has so many boundaries everywhere, we really need to partner to work across boundaries. That's especially important with vegetation, because vegetation is certainly not paying attention to our legal boundaries. And the other important aspect with this is plants. We recognize the importance of plants, and they're really the foundation of these ecosystems. And there are other agencies at the state that deal with other aspects of the land. So we have Division of Wildlife Resources. They're tasked with managing wildlife throughout the state. Division of Water Quality, they're dealing with the water quality on a lot of these water bodies. However, for us as the land manager, really vegetation is the best lever that we can pull to care for this land and take care of it. And so we can't talk about vegetation management without making sense of weed control. And so we just want to start simply here. What is a weed? And really, that's a very subjective term. So for one person, you might love this plant, and for your neighbor, it's the worst plant ever. And so what is a weed is quite subjective. However, there are certain plants that are deemed noxious weeds, and that is a legal designation. And there is landowner responsibility for containing and controlling those plants because they have adverse effects to our economy, to public health, as well as our ecosystems. And so in controlling these plants, we can think about it in terms of controlling a population. And in order to control a population, we need to control how that population reproduces. And really what we need to do with plant control is have our strategies aligned with the biology of these plants. And so some simple ways to think about that are an annual plant versus a perennial plant. So an annual plant only reproduces by seed, and that can be handled quite differently than a perennial plant. So an annual plant only reproduces by seed and typically only lives for 1 year, hence the word annual. A perennial plant is long-lived and lives over many years. And these basic concepts are a big part of what is built into integrated pest management. And so integrated pest management, or in this case, integrated weed management, is looking at all the different tools in the toolbox to control these populations. They include physical control, and so that would be something as simple as hand pulling a weed. And so this would be an effective approach for an annual plant because we could pull it before it produces its seed, and we've stopped reproduction. Then there's chemical control. This would include herbicides. And herbicides are mostly used with perennial plants, since in order to stop their reproduction, we would have to kill them and they have a long lifespan. There's also biological control, which usually involves releasing bugs that are from the weed's home range, so introducing a natural predator. And then there's ecological control, or sometimes called cultural control, and this would include things like grazing. It would include reseeding. Sometimes the use of fire might be considered part of this. Also water management. And so with all of these approaches, they need to often be used in combination. And an important topic to cover also is the responsible use of herbicides. So with this plant work, there's a lot of criticism over the use of herbicides. And I think a lot of that criticism is valid. However, the main issue with the use of herbicides is irresponsible use of herbicide. And so what does it mean to use an herbicide responsibly? I think the first thing is what most people are familiar with, which is the label for the herbicide. So a bunch of research goes into the label, which says exactly how that herbicide can and cannot be used. And it's very important that we're paying attention to that label and following it. But in our work on sovereign lands, we're really trying to take it a step further and work on best practices and a long-term picture for what we're trying to achieve. So we're looking at revegetation and restoration and what are our goals, and we're really trying to focus on really what is the context of the work that we're doing, why we are doing it, and then trying to achieve a state where we have our restoration goal, our desired end state, and don't need to rely on herbicides anymore. And really, part of responsible herbicide use is also using this integrated approach, because often chemical alone will not do the trick. So we have to incorporate all of these different strategies.
So we manage vegetation in these really important wetland areas. I'm sure many of you guys know the importance of these wetlands. They're not just important to our state or our region, they really are of hemispherical importance, supporting hundreds of migratory bird species along the Pacific and Central flyways. These wetlands also support numerous recreational opportunities, which are important for our communities. And invasive plants in these wetlands, namely Phragmites, Russian olive, and tamarisk, those are kind of the big three, really impede these ecosystem functions and services, specifically navigation, recreation, and wildlife use. So what we're after in these wetlands are to control these invasive species and then restore a diverse mosaic of native plant communities. And we know that even if we use an integrated approach to control these 3 species, the native plant communities that we want won't recover as quickly as we want them to. And so for that reason, like Keith had just mentioned, we are really striving to pursue an active revegetation approach so we can get those native bulrushes, sedges, grasses, forbs, trees, and shrubs in these wetlands so that they can function properly. And our goal is to improve these public trust doctrine values that Keith mentioned in the beginning. So that's the wildlife habitat, the aquatic beauty, public recreation, and navigation.
Okay, so with all the challenges that we face managing all this land, to name a few, scale, all of these waterways have significantly altered hydrology. We have these incredibly highly invasive plants that Ray just mentioned. How can we be successful? Well, we've identified what we think are 4 key components to success for this work, and they are ongoing funding, a dedicated coordinator, partnerships, and research collaboration. And those 4 things for a specific issue or location, like a specific plant or a specific location like the Jordan River. And all these are aimed at recognizing that we have to do this work over many years, over a long time period, and the problems are so large that we need to stay focused, and we're going to have to do some degree of prioritization on the work that we do. And that recipe for success was really established from our efforts working on Great Salt Lake Phragmites. Great Salt Lake Phragmites was estimated to, there was an estimated 23,000 acres of Phragmites in the wetlands in 2012. This was from some early USU research. And the next steps of that research started looking at how we can control Phragmites and revegetate these wetlands. So we're really thankful for all that work out of the USU Wetland Ecology and Research Lab. It really laid the foundation for our best practices. And there was also increased public awareness around the negative impacts of Phragmites, and then awareness of just how much there is in Great Salt Lake wetlands. So in 2014, the legislature gave our division funding specifically for Great Salt Lake Phragmites. And our division quickly realized that the problem was too large and complex to handle it and handle the funding with the current staff. So I was hired in 2016 as a dedicated coordinator, mainly aimed at this specific issue. And since I started, in the 7 years I've been with the division, we've built a ton of partnerships for this work. Our biggest partner for Great Salt Lake is the Division of Wildlife Resources, and so they are tasked with managing wildlife throughout the state, and Phragmites has a massive negative impact on bird habitat, and the wetland managers for Division of Wildlife Resources were really the pioneers that got started in actively doing something about Phragmites in the wetlands. And we've come a long way since then. So we've started partnering with them to vastly expand the area that we're working. We have very detailed best practices, and we've made huge strides in Phragmites on Great Salt Lake. We're doing strategic planning now that's site-specific with all of the water managers nearby. So we're deciding where we're going to prioritize the water that we do have. We're working together for these treatments over our boundaries, and then we're all tied together with the same restoration goals, namely bird habitat and also getting water to Great Salt Lake, because Phragmites has a big negative impact on hydrology and the flow of water to the lake. And these pictures show some of our success. So this is a project in Farmington Bay of Great Salt Lake, and this first photo here is before we do any work, and it is a sea of Phragmites as far as you can see. And then this photo here is the same spot 5 years later. And here we have diverse native vegetation that has actually come back passively mostly. We've got open water We've got some mudflat playa habitat out here. And then these other photos are that same project area, but some different locations. And you can see we've got diverse vegetation through here. We have open water habitat for birds. And we're really restoring what the Great Salt Lake shoreline used to look like. And so then on Utah Lake, there's been a similar effort. The work is a little bit different. Utah Lake is different in a lot of ways. There is a recreation focus with the shoreline trail being put in, but we also have our goals of habitat and biodiversity there as well. One of our main partners on Utah Lake was Utah County, who really got started with the on-the-ground work, and then the Utah Lake Commission, who's been getting landowner permissions for a lot of the work that's being done and getting funding. And with the collaborative efforts and then applying the best practices that we learned from Great Salt Lake and the USU lab, we've reduced Phragmites by over 70%. And we now have ongoing funding for this. So we relied on grants prior, but this is the first year that we'll have ongoing funding. So we're dedicated to seeing this project through year after year to keep maintaining the wetlands around the lake. And I think it's important to point out that the Division of Water Quality is doing their water quality study currently for Utah Lake. And a key component of the ecosystem that they've identified for water quality is macrophytes, which is water-loving vegetation, so this wetland vegetation. And I think there'll be future collaborations aimed specifically at that, just how plants are connected to our water quality in the lake. And in order to do that, we're going to have to do a lot of revegetation.
Yeah, and as Keith just described, they've made massive strides on Great Salt Lake and Utah Lake in terms of controlling Phragmites. And I would say that we're definitely in the beginning stages of that on the Jordan River. That's partially why I was hired. So I just started in June working with the Jordan River Commission and also the division to try to tackle Phragmites on the river. And I think we can take some of the best practices that we've developed for the lakeshore wetlands and apply them to the Jordan River, although there are some unique challenges that we'll have to overcome. Just to name a couple, so on the Jordan River, Phragmites, it spans the whole channel in some spots along the river. So this is a big challenge for access. Also, if we were going to mow Phragmites, that would create issues with litter kind of damming up the river downstream. Another example, there's disconnected floodplains from the river, which I think presents a huge challenge for how we're going to recover a lot of the native plant species that rely on more connected hydrology. There's also challenges with land ownership. There's multiple landowners, multiple stakeholders. Kind of a theme of this morning is collaboration. I think the Jordan River is no exception there. So we're going to need to have really good coordination, communication to make progress on controlling Phragmites on the Jordan River. We do have a cooperative weed management area for the Jordan River. So we have roughly $200,000 that can be spent every year towards project work on the river. And what's cool about this funding is that it can support work not only on sovereign lands, but also adjacent lands within the Jordan River corridor. As a part of the CWMA, we have a grant program, so land managers can apply for vegetation improvement funding. And there's also a lot of technical assistance with the CWMA, so through the commission and also the division, collectively there's a lot of support for people that are starting to manage Phragmites along the corridor. In the wetlands that we manage, we control Russian olive and tamarisk. So again, these are non-native invasive plants. So non-native being they're not from here. Invasive, they're aggressive. They typically grow in really dense monotypic stands, which impedes navigation, recreation, wildlife use. So a typical approach to control these invasive trees, usually we're doing a cut stump treatment where you can cut the tree at the base and apply an herbicide to the living cells that are exposed on the stump. And we'll often do this in a phased manner because we do acknowledge if we were just to snap our fingers and remove all of the invasive trees at once, this could have really negative impacts on bird habitat. There wouldn't be much shade. So for that reason, we are kind of working at things typically pretty piecemeal. And we're also usually revegetating during and after these control efforts. So the revegetation piece is really key. The Jordan River Commission has been running their tall pot native tree planting program for several years now, and that's a program that I'm taking on. So we have native trees that are sourced from the Jordan River. They're propagated at a nursery, and then landowners and managers on the Jordan River can apply for these trees, and then we'll engage volunteers to plant these trees to kind of encourage that revegetation throughout the corridor. I'm really excited to expand these revegetation efforts, thinking about more species that we could put out onto the landscape, and also the scale at which we're pursuing revegetation.
And so in addition to the specific species and projects we just talked about, we have a lot of other considerations as well for managing vegetation on all this land. So coming back to the noxious weed list, as a landowner, we are responsible for controlling these noxious weeds, so we always have to keep an eye out for those. And it's important to specifically point out early detection and rapid response species. So those are species that we do not have yet, or we only have them in small populations. And the best move there is prevention and keeping these species from becoming a problem. So we're trying our best to keep our eye on any of those species moving in. And in general, I think it's important for us to constantly be thinking about what is worth controlling. And for this, context really matters.
Yeah, so an example of that is puncture vine, or goat head is what many people know it as. It's that annual non-native invasive plant with the spiky seed pods. And this is one of my priority species working along the Jordan River, because it's really an impediment to recreation, because it can get stuck in dog paws, it can pop your bike tubes, and that's really problematic if we're trying to promote recreation along the Jordan River and the Jordan River Parkway.
And so some other considerations that we're trying to stay focused on is biodiversity and pollinator habitat. We recognize, again, that this is really important land that we're managing, these riparian and wetland areas, and we really hope to reestablish a lot of native plant biodiversity. Another issue is the decline of pollinator habitat and pollinator species, and we could be a key player in bringing back a lot of this pollinator habitat. So we're always thinking big picture with all this work that we're doing.
Lastly, we just wanted to let everyone know that we're very open to partnering with people, especially researchers, for example. So if you're a researcher out there who studies weed control or native plants, definitely come chat with us. I wanted to plug that our Jordan River Cooperative Weed Management Area request for proposals will be released in January. So this is for vegetation improvement projects along the Jordan River. It can be on public or private lands. And so encouraging people to apply for that in January. If you're an adjacent landowner to some of the sovereign lands that we talked about, please reach out to us if you have ideas of how we could partner. And I'm sure there are many other opportunities that we haven't thought of. So come say hi.
And we have quite a bit of time for questions. We would love questions. Yeah.
What has been your main approach to suppressing Phragmites? What does that look like?
Yeah, so our best practices for Phragmites involve using herbicide to kill it. And then we do biomass removal, typically with mowing or trampling. And then in areas on the Jordan River, we're hand cutting it with brush cutters. We know that we need to do that for typically a minimum of 3 years. Sometimes it's as long as 5 years for any given patch. And then we're monitoring basically the biodegradation of the rhizome mat of Phragmites and waiting for that to happen, and then we come in and we do revegetation. We do a lot of water management as well for Phragmites on the big scale, so timing where we're sending water and how much, and really with the drought in Great Salt Lake, we've had to ration the water that we have, because another key component is the herbicide does not work if the plant is not well watered, and so we don't want to be putting that chemical out there if it's not well watered. We also do a lot of grazing, so we graze thousands of acres around Great Salt Lake, and that's a really helpful tool, but it won't kill Phragmites, so usually it's used in combination with the other treatments. And sometimes we'll use it to maintain areas where we've gained success, and then in other areas where we don't have funding to do the full treatments, we'll use grazing to contain Phragmites, because it does spread really well by seed, so they would at least stop the seed production. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about the use of insects to control tamarisk?
Yeah. So the tamarisk beetle has been very successful in controlling tamarisk. And the way a biological control would work is there's usually around 10 years of research or more to get it approved to ensure that that species is host specific. So they do a ton of research to make sure that that bug or whatever they're releasing is only going to damage that specific plant. And then it's released, and the goal for biological control is not to eradicate any plant species, it's to control the population. And so the population of that bug species will kind of mirror the population of the plant. So as it decimates the plant, there's less food for that bug, its population will decline, and those populations go up and down. But the beetle has been really successful with tamarisk, and if you float sections of the Green and Colorado River, southern Utah, you'll see huge stands of sickly or dead-looking tamarisk, and what's really exciting is now what you see is willow busting through and coming back. I will say there is a new biocontrol for Phragmites that's being worked on. It's a moth. We're really excited about that. And it has actually been released for trials in Canada, in eastern Canada. That one is complicated by the fact that we do have a native species of Phragmites. So I think that it might be possible, or it might be difficult to have it approved for release in the United States because we do have that native species that I don't know if they'll be able to prove host specificity there. Yeah.
Once the Phragmites are cut down, you have that thick mass of them. Does that mass need to be removed, or can you just over time it will break down?
It's not really feasible to remove it. So, and at least in our case, most everything that we do, we're just waiting for it to break down over time. And what's interesting is we do have areas, vast areas where we've removed Phragmites in Great Salt Lake, where we actually have sediment deposition taking place on top. And so like we're having a new top layer of soil and plants growing in that, and you dig down, you can find these old legacy rhizome mats that are hiding below. But in a smaller scale, like if it's in a pond or something, you could dig it up. But you wouldn't want to do that until at least 30 days after you've sprayed it with herbicide. And probably you wouldn't want to do that until you've done multiple years of treatment, because any little fragment of living Phragmites that's in the ground will resprout. Yeah.
If you were trying to control Phragmites in a sensitive water area and you couldn't use chemical control, what would be the best time of year and mode of control to use to try and get rid of that population?
So the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative, not Great Salt Lake, the Great Lakes in the Midwest, they have some interesting information on using flooding to kill Phragmites. Their hydrology is different in the Great Lakes, and we would possibly be able to use this on Utah Lake, but they time mowing it when the water's low, and then before the plant has time to regrow, if it gets reflooded, it will kill it. And we actually saw this in an area on Great Salt Lake in the Willard Spur, where we only did a single treatment of one spray and mow, and this was when the water was really low in 2022, and then this year we had a huge water year, and Willard Spur filled back up with deep water, and it disappeared in 1 year. Basically, we had this giant patch of Phragmites 1 year, the next year we had lake again. So that's one thing that I would suggest would be drowning it, but of course you'd have to have the ability to flood the water. And so you could cut it down when it's dormant and flood it while it's still dormant, and then the plant won't be able to receive oxygen, so hopefully it would die. You need at least 18 inches of water typically to have that work. Okay?
Okay,
Thank you
you.
guys.
All right.